What we found was terrible. We weren't supposed to be the ones. The Artemis program had already laid the groundwork, a lunar base, years of routine cargo drops, even a skeleton crew running experiments. What NASA told the public was true. Humanity was poised to step further into the stars. But what they didn't tell anyone, not even most of us on the team, was that they'd stopped getting clear signals from the moon weeks ago. I wasn't the first choice for the mission. None of us were. We weren't astronauts. We were researchers, specialists in niche fields, geology, astrobiology, electromagnetic physics, linguistics, and in my case, experimental robotics. It felt strange being shipped off-world after just a crash course in lunar protocols and survival training. Still, we trusted NASA. They didn't send people to die, at least not on purpose. Our shuttle, Hermes II, landed on schedule. The view was breathtaking at first, the Earth like a marble suspended in infinite blackness. But as we descended to the lunar base, things began to feel wrong. The docking bay was intact, but the external lights were dead, and the base's comms were unresponsive. That wasn't a total surprise. Part of our mission was to repair the systems. At stepping into that airlock, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It didn't help that the lunar surface outside was eerily quiet. Not even the occasional micrometeorite pinging off the hull. Inside the base, the first thing we noticed was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was there, a faint, metallic tang, like blood and ozone. The lights flickered when we powered them up, casting long, shifting shadows across the empty corridors. The base should have been bustling, even with a skeleton crew. Instead, it was silent, as though the place had been abandoned in a hurry. Dr. Patel, the geologist, found the first sign of trouble. In the main lab, a trail of reddish-brown smears led from one of the workstations to the vent near the ceiling. "Blood," she whispered, but no one answered. We were all staring at the same thing. The workstation itself was smashed, shards of glass and metal scattered across the floor. And on the far wall, written in something dark and dry, was a message. "Don't look up." We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a joke, something scrawled during a stressful simulation, but that didn't explain the damage or the fact that the base's logs showed an error message instead of crew activity. The last entry was a garbled file, time-stamped 14 days ago. The day communication had been lost. Then the power flickered again. And, for a split second, we heard it. Something skittering in the vents above us. "Could be rats," Dr. Green, the biologist, said, but no one believed him. By the time we reached the living quarters, the tension was unbearable. Each door we opened revealed more chaos, upturned furniture, personal belongings scattered as though their owners had been interrupted mid-task. But the most disturbing part? No bodies, no signs of the crew. "Where the hell did they go?" Dr. Kim, the linguist, asked, her voice trembling. We didn't have an answer, at least not yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't something NASA had prepared us for. And as we stood in the dim light, staring at a new message scratched into the wall, "It knows you're here," I couldn't help but wonder if we'd made a terrible mistake coming to the moon. Dr. Green broke the silence first, his voice tight and too loud in the stillness. "We should start the systems check, prioritize power and comms, get out of here as soon as possible." None of us argued. Even Patel, who always prided herself on being the skeptic, looked pale and distracted. We split into pairs. Green and Patel headed to the engineering bay to restore the base's power grid, while Dr. Kim and Dr. Vargas, the physicist, went to assess the comms array. I stayed behind in the main lab to see what I could salvage from the base's automated systems. I hated being alone, but there wasn't much choice. My job was to interface with the autonomous robotics network and see if anything was still functioning. I worked quickly, trying not to think about the smeared blood, or whatever it was, that had dried into the walls. The robotics console was partially operational, though its data logs were corrupted. I managed to reboot a single maintenance drone. Its camera feed flickered to life, showing a grainy view of its surroundings. A dim hallway lined with storage lockers. As I piloted the drone down the corridor, static rippled through the feed. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, something darting across the edge of the camera's view. I stopped the drone, panning the camera, but the hall was empty. Then I heard it again, the skittering, louder this time, not just from the vents, but from somewhere deeper in the base. "Guys," I called over the comms, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are any of you near the storage hall?" Green's voice crackled back. "Negative. We're still in engineering." "Not us," Kim added. "Why?" I hesitated. "I thought I saw something." "What kind of something?" Vargas asked. "I don't know," I admitted, my hands tightening on the console. "Probably nothing. Just keep an eye out." The others didn't press me, but I could hear the unease in their voices. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all felt the same thing. We weren't alone. 30 minutes later, Green and Patel managed to restore partial power to the base. The lights brightened, and the air circulation kicked back on, though the hum of the systems felt oppressive rather than reassuring. With power restored, I accessed more of the drone network. That's when I found the footage. At first, it was just routine logs, dull recordings of the crew performing maintenance, eating meals, laughing at private jokes. But then, the timestamps shifted. The footage grew chaotic, the crew's movements frantic, people running through the halls, shouting. The audio was corrupted, filled with bursts of static and garbled voices, but one word came through clearly, repeated again and again. "Run." The final video was from a drone in the medical bay. It showed one of the crew, a woman I recognized from the mission briefings as Dr. Elena Moreau, huddled in a corner. She was shaking, her eyes wide with terror. Something moved in the shadows behind her. It was impossible to tell what it was. Just a blur of darkness, its form shifting unnaturally, like it didn't belong in this world. Moreau turned, her scream cutting through the static as the feed abruptly ended. I sat frozen, my heart pounding. Whatever happened here, it wasn't a technical failure or a simple accident. Something had hunted these people. "Everyone, meet back in the main lab," I said, forcing myself to sound calm. "Now." When the team regrouped, I showed them the footage. No one spoke as the final clip played, the room thick with tension. "What the hell is that?" Vargas finally whispered. "Does it matter?" Kim snapped, her voice rising. "We need to leave. Now." "We can't," Green said, his tone grim. "The comms array is fried beyond repair. We'd have to reach the shuttle and hope we can signal from there." "Then let's go," Patel said. "We can't stay here." We grabbed what we could, data drives, tools, anything that seemed useful, and headed for the airlock. But as we moved through the base, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with an almost tangible dread. And then we heard it. A low, guttural noise, like a growl, reverberated through the halls. It didn't sound like any machine or animal I'd ever heard. "What the hell was that?" Patel whispered, clutching her equipment like a lifeline. "Just keep moving," Green said, though his voice shook. The noise grew louder, closer. The skittering returned, now accompanied by wet, squelching sounds that turned my stomach. We broke into a run. It wasn't until we reached the airlock that we realized something horrifying. The outer door was open, and outside, in the weak lunar light, faint tracks led away from the base. Tracks that weren't human. The tracks disappeared into the darkness beyond the base's lights, trailing toward the distant hills. We stood there, frozen, staring at the prints. They were deep and irregular, like something heavy had been dragging itself across the lunar dust. How is that possible? Kim stammered. Nothing survives out there without a suit. Nothing human. Who said it was human? Vargas muttered, his voice low but shaking. The growling sound echoed behind us again, closer this time. My head snapped around, heart hammering as I scanned the shadows of the base. The hallways seemed darker, as if the light itself was being swallowed by something lurking just out of sight. "We can't go back in there," Patel said, her voice rising. "We need to get to the shuttle. Now." I hesitated, glancing at the tracks again. Part of me wanted to follow them, to see where they led. But another part of me, the instinct screaming in the back of my mind, knew that whatever made those prints was not something we wanted to meet. We made a break for the shuttle. The base's airlock hissed as we passed through, the cold lunar surface stretching out before us. Even in the weightlessness of the moon's gravity, every step felt like a struggle, the silence around us oppressive and unnerving. The faint glow of the earth above offered no comfort. It only reminded us how far from home we truly were. The shuttle came into view, perched like a beacon of hope against the barren landscape. But something was wrong. The hatch was open. "No," Green whispered. "We sealed it before landing. We sealed it." We slowed, staring at the gaping entrance. The onboard systems should have locked the hatch after our departure, a failsafe to keep the shuttle secure. The fact that it was open now meant something's been inside, I said, finishing the thought aloud. "Do we have another choice?" Patel asked, looking over her shoulder at the base. The darkness in its windows felt like eyes watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Without answering, Green took the lead, stepping cautiously into the shuttle. The rest of us followed, weapons improvised from tools held tightly in our hands. The interior of the shuttle was dim, its emergency lights casting an eerie red glow. Supplies were scattered across the floor, panels torn open as if something had been searching for something. "It's still here," Vargas whispered, gripping a wrench so tightly his knuckles were white. "Don't say that," Kim hissed. I moved to the cockpit, my breath shallow as I scanned the controls. The shuttle's systems were active, but the fuel reserves showed a critical leak. We couldn't leave. "Guys," I said, my voice trembling, "we've got a problem." "We know," Patel snapped, gesturing to the claw-like marks gouged into the walls near the rear compartment. The skittering sound returned, louder now, coming from somewhere inside the shuttle. "Where?" Green whispered, turning in slow circles, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Then, from the shadows near the cargo bay, something moved. At first, it was just a shape, indistinct and impossible to define. But as it stepped into the faint light, my blood ran cold. It was tall, its body unnaturally elongated, with limbs that seemed to shift and twist as though they were made of liquid shadow. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void, featureless except for a faint shimmer, like heat haze. For a moment, no one moved. Then it lunged. The thing was faster than anything I'd ever seen, its limbs stretching out like tendrils as it closed the distance between us. Patel screamed, swinging her makeshift weapon wildly, but the creature was already on her. It didn't kill her. Not at first. Instead, it wrapped itself around her, the darkness of its body flowing over her like ink. Her screams became muffled, then silent, as she was swallowed whole. "Run!" Green shouted, shoving me toward the cockpit. The rest was a blur. We stumbled over each other in our panic, the creature's guttural growls and wet, slithering movements filling the small space. Somehow, we made it to the cockpit, slamming the door shut behind us. "What the hell was that?" Vargas screamed, his voice cracking. "I don't know," Green shouted back, "but it's not stopping." The door shook violently, the creature pounding against it with a force that made the whole shuttle shudder. "We can't stay here," I said, my mind racing. "The base, it's the only place with enough power to send a distress signal." "You want to go back?" Kim asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. "That thing will kill us." "It'll kill us here too," Green said grimly. "If we don't do something, we're dead either way." The pounding on the door grew louder, and the lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows over our terrified faces. "We need to move. Now," I said, my voice steady, despite the terror clawing at my chest. No one argued. We opened the emergency hatch, the lunar cold biting into us as we fled back toward the base. Behind us, the creature howled, a sound that echoed in my bones, filling me with a primal, inescapable dread. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't running fast enough. We sprinted across the lunar surface, our boots kicking up clouds of dust that hung suspended in the low gravity. The silence of the moon was no longer serene. It was suffocating, amplifying every terrified breath, every pounding heartbeat. The creature's howls echoed faintly behind us, carried by the vibrations in our suits. It wasn't just following, it was hunting. The base came into view, its jagged silhouette barely visible in the distance. Green, ahead of us, slowed slightly, turning his head to glance back. His shout of warning was garbled by the comms. "It's..." Something black and impossibly fast darted into his path. For a brief moment, Green seemed to freeze, his body outlined in the pale earthlight. Then he was gone, dragged sideways into the darkness, his scream cutting off like someone had flipped a switch. "Keep moving," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. Patel was gone, Green was gone, and the rest of us were running on fumes, our oxygen meters flashing warnings as we stumbled toward the airlock. I didn't dare look back, but I felt it, that terrible sensation of being watched, of something bearing down on us with inhuman patience. When we finally reached the airlock, Vargas slammed his hand on the control panel, shouting, "Open, damn it, open!" The door hissed and slid open, agonizingly slow. Kim and I shoved him through, practically throwing ourselves inside as the outer hatch sealed behind us. The interior lights flickered to life, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. "We can't keep doing this," Vargas panted, collapsing against the wall. His face was pale, his eyes wide and wild. "It's picking us off, one by one." Kim was trembling, her arms wrapped around herself as she whispered, "We should have never come here. We should have left when we had the chance." "We didn't have a chance," I snapped, though my anger was born from fear. "The shuttle's compromised. The comms are fried. And now we're trapped in here with that thing." "Then what do we do?" Kim asked, her voice rising. "What the hell do we do?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We regrouped in the command center, the hum of the restored power systems offering little comfort. Vargas managed to pull up the base's emergency logs, but most of them were corrupted. The few that remained were chilling. The crew had been studying something they found beneath the lunar surface, a structure buried in the regolith, ancient and alien. The logs described strange symbols, unrecognizable materials, and an artifact they'd recovered and brought back to the base. That's what started this, Vargas muttered, scrolling through the fragmented entries. They disturbed something. Something that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. What happened to the artifact? I asked, dreading the answer. Kim pointed to a line in the logs. Relocated to containment chamber B4. Active monitoring required. You're kidding me, I said, my stomach sinking. B4 was on the far side of the base, the same side we'd fled from. There has to be a connection, Vargas said. If we destroy it, maybe we can stop this. Or we'll make it angrier, Kim shot back. We don't have a choice, I said, standing up. If that thing is tied to the artifact, we need to deal with it. It's the only lead we have. No one liked the plan, but there wasn't a better one. Armed with what tools we could find, wrenches, a welding torch, and an old flare gun, we set out for containment chamber B4. The corridors were darker than before, the flickering lights casting warped shadows on the walls. Every sound, every creak, every hiss of the ventilation system set my nerves on edge. When we reached the door to B4, it was already open. Inside, the chamber was wrecked. Monitors were smashed. Cables hung from the ceiling, like veins ripped from a body. And in the center of the room, surrounded by shattered containment glass, was the artifact. It was smaller than I'd expected, no larger than a basketball, and its surface shimmered with an oily blackness that seemed to ripple like water. Looking at it made my head hurt, as though it was wrong in a way my brain couldn't comprehend. That's it? Vargas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That's it, I said, stepping toward it. Kim grabbed my arm. Wait, we don't know what'll happen if you touch it. Before I could respond, the skittering sound returned, louder and closer than ever. The creature was here. No time, I said, breaking free from her grip. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they hovered over the artifact. The closer I got, the more the room seemed to warp, the air vibrating with an almost deafening hum. As soon as my hand made contact, the hum became a roar, and the lights exploded in a shower of sparks. In the darkness, I heard it, the creature's shriek of rage, so loud it felt like it would split my skull. And then, a voice, faint and distorted, whispering directly into my mind. You shouldn't have come. The artifact pulsed beneath my hand, and the last thing I saw before the world went white was the creature lunging toward us, its body unraveling into a storm of shadows. And then, nothing. When I woke up, everything was quiet, too quiet. The first thing I noticed was the pain, a deep, throbbing ache in my head, like I'd been dropped from orbit and landed face first. The second thing was the darkness. The base's lights were completely dead, and the only illumination came from my suit's flickering HUD. Kim? Vargas? I croaked, my voice dry and hoarse. No answer. I scrambled to my feet, my boots crunching against shards of broken glass and debris. The containment chamber was in ruins, and the artifact, it was gone. Only a faint, blackened scorch mark on the floor remained where it had been. Hello? I tried again, louder this time, forcing the panic out of my voice. A faint static crackled in my helmet's comms. Then, a voice, weak and trembling. I'm here. It was Kim. Relief flooded through me. Where are you? I asked, glancing around, though the darkness swallowed everything beyond a few feet. I don't know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I ran when the lights went out. I think I'm near the engineering bay. but I can't see anything. My suit's oxygen is low. Stay where you are, I said. I'll find you. I switched on my suit's emergency beacon, the faint red light cutting through the blackness. My hands shook as I gripped the flare gun, every shadow in the corridor looking like it could move, like it wanted to move. Vargas, I called out as I moved. Silence. The base was eerily empty, the usual hum of machinery replaced by a suffocating stillness. Every so often, I thought I heard something. Soft footsteps, the faint scrape of metal on metal. But when I turned, there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I found Kim huddled in a corner near the engineering bay. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, and her oxygen meter blinked dangerously low. "We have to get to the reserve tanks," I said, helping her to her feet. "The nearest supply is in medical." She nodded wordlessly, her eyes darting to the shadows behind me. The two of us moved as quickly as we could, the flare gun clutched tightly in my hand. Kim carried a wrench, though she looked too terrified to use it. As we approached the medical bay, the skittering returned. "No," Kim whispered, gripping my arm. "No, no, no." "Keep moving," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The sound grew louder, echoing through the halls. I turned just in time to see something shift in the darkness, a ripple of shadow, the faint glint of something wet and sharp. "Run!" I shouted, pushing Kim ahead of me. We sprinted into the medical bay, slamming the door shut behind us. I locked it manually, praying the ancient mechanism would hold. Kim collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. I grabbed an oxygen tank from the supply closet, hooking it up to her suit as quickly as I could. As her breathing steadied, I slumped against the wall, trying to catch my own breath. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. The artifact was gone, the base was falling apart, and the creature was still out there. We were trapped, and every option led to the same grim conclusion. Survival wasn't guaranteed. But as I sat there, staring at the flickering emergency lights, an idea began to form, a desperate, insane idea. "The reactor," I said. Kim frowned. "What? If we overload the reactor, we might be able to destroy the base, and that thing with it." Her eyes widened. "You can't be serious. That'll kill us too." "Not if we make it to the shuttle in time," I said. "We set the overload, then we run. If we're lucky, the explosion will wipe out whatever's hunting us. And if we're not?" I didn't answer. Kim stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's do it." We made our way to the reactor room, every step feeling like it could be our last. The skittering sounds followed us, always just out of sight, always just close enough to remind us we weren't alone. When we reached the reactor, I worked quickly, overriding the safety protocols and initiating a manual overload. The system protested, alarms blaring as the countdown began. 10 minutes. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Kim's arm. We ran. The base shook as the reactor began to destabilize, the alarms growing louder with each passing second. The creature was on us now, its guttural growls echoing through the corridors. As we neared the airlock, it appeared, blocking our path. "Keep going," I shouted, raising the flare gun. Kim hesitated, but then she ran, disappearing into the airlock. I fired the flare, the bright light illuminating the creature for the first time. Its body twisted and writhed, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it recoiled from the fire. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran. The airlock sealed behind me, and Kim helped me into the shuttle. "Go!" I shouted, collapsing into a seat as she powered up the engines. The shuttle lifted off, the base growing smaller beneath us. Then the reactor exploded. The shock wave hit us, sending the shuttle spinning, but Kim managed to stabilize it. Through the window, I watched as the base was consumed by fire, the flames spreading across the lunar surface. For a moment, there was silence. Then faintly, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. The creature's growl, distant but unmistakable. It wasn't over. The shuttle drifted in silence, the Earth a distant glowing orb against the black void. Kim and I sat in the cockpit, staring out at the moon's surface as the fire from the explosion flickered and died. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the shuttle's engines and our shallow breathing. Then Kim broke the silence. "Do you think it's gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I didn't know. The base was obliterated. Whatever artifact the crew had uncovered, whatever they'd awakened, it was buried now, reduced to dust. But the growl I'd heard as we escaped still echoed in my mind. It didn't feel like victory. We had barely enough oxygen to make it back to the orbiting research vessel. As Kim worked to establish a connection, I stared at the moon, my thoughts spiraling. The creature wasn't bound to the base. It had been outside, in the open. Tracks in the lunar dust proved that. And if it could survive out there, what was stopping it from following us? "Connection established," Kim said, breaking me from my thoughts. "Sending distress signal now." "Any response?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not yet, but they'll pick us up. They have to." I nodded, but her words offered little comfort. I kept glancing at the shuttle's windows, half expecting to see that shapeless, shadowy form pressed against the glass. Hours passed. No response. Kim eventually slumped in her seat, exhaustion overcoming her. I stayed awake, gripping the flare gun, though I knew it would do nothing in the vacuum of space. I must have dozed off at some point, because when I woke, the cabin lights were dim, and the shuttle was eerily quiet. "Kim," I called out. No response. I turned, expecting to see her still at the controls, but her seat was empty. My heart sank. "Kim," I called again, louder this time. A faint sound came from the back of the shuttle, a soft, wet noise, like something shifting against metal. I stood, gripping the flare gun tightly as I moved toward the noise. My breaths came shallow and quick, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The cargo bay was dark, the emergency lights casting long, flickering shadows. "Kim," I whispered. Then I saw her. She was standing with her back to me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Kim," I said again.